Hello and welcome to the podcast where we talk about watches, time, and how to spend it. My name's Felix.
And I'm Andy. How you going, Felix?
I was trying to come up with some Kenny Rogers puns, and then I thought about, not promoting gambling and gambling responsibly, and I got into like a momentary tailspin, but I think I've recovered now.
I love it. I love it. Well, you're leading with Kenny Rogers when we should be leading with today's guest.
We should, yes. Kristen Shirley, a lifestyle luxury journalist, a founder of La Patiala. We had a good chat to Kristen about the world of watches and how she came into it and what's going on, like a bit of her sort of what's on the ground and what's cool and happening in America, what brands are doing interesting things, who's coming up, all that sort of jazz.
Yeah, she had a nice perspective, so I'm keen to get into that chat. But before we do that, a fair bit of stuff has happened, Felix. I think a lot of it a little bit unexpected, or at least caught me off guard.
Yeah, Q4 2022 is getting wild.
Yeah, and it starts with a out of cycle, as they call it, Rolex release, 2022. They brought a few new Deepsea. They brought a big new Deepsea out in addition to the two new ones that they updated earlier this year.
Talk to me, de facto OT Rolex correspondent. What's the top line?
Okay, so it is a 50 mil Deepsea challenge. Big news here is titanium.
Not the very practical 11,000 meters water resistance.
No, or the 50 millimeter case.
Like 20. How tall is it? Like 20 something mil?
Yeah, it's you're talking centimeters. You're actually beyond the millimeters, I think, when it comes to this watch.
You can do this in meters. That's 0.05 of a meter across.
Yes, it's a serious watch. Obviously, titanium, first production model with titanium. Interesting. A lot of people, I don't know, measuring things, saying that they made a prototype years ago. Doesn't really matter. It's the first production model. So
we saw that Yachtmaster. Wasn't there like one of their sort of sailor sort of?
Yeah. It was titanium. So everyone's like pointing out, oh, it's not the first one. Who cares? It's the first one that you can go and buy if you have a spare 37,000 Australian dollars.
That's a lot of money.
It's a lot, but it's titanium. So it's sort of, I guess they have to kind of price it between steel and precious metal.
Oh, man. Yeah.
What
I find most interesting about this is the fact that, from my limited understanding of the Rolex world, no one asked for this. No one wanted this. And the reception hasn't been as raving as it normally is.
Well, I think who's it for, right? Like the size, it's just such a big watch. Titanium's cool, exciting to see Rolex do titanium, in production stuff. But it's so big that the number of people that could comfortably wear that watch is pretty slim. I mean, you've got big wrists, and I think even you'd be lost wearing this watch.
50 is big for me.
It's big, it's doable, but you have to be really into it. And look, some people like it. Some people love big watches. There's still a market for big, chunky watches, and I'm sure it's going to wear better than, other 50 mil watches out there.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. The thing I find interesting is they call it RLX titanium.
Of course they do. Rolex doesn't produce, no, top tier luxury brand is, they're all about the proprietary metals, and all you have to do is change 0.05% of the alloy or whatever, get a patent.
It's just the name, like RLX. It's just sort of not, I don't know. It's just a little bit.
It's technical and
it's lacking creativity, I think. For Rolex, who love to come up with names for their alloys and their metals. It's sort of lacking in creativity.
Rolex titanium alloy. We haven't discussed this at all. What are you calling it? If you don't like RLX,
I don't know, Roltanium or something. That's what they would have called it.
Titanex. Oh, nice. Titan. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, odd move.
Odd move. It's an odd looking watch. It just looks like a very big Deepsea. Called the Deepsea Challenge. So it's cool to see. Something different, unusual time of the year.
Place the Yachtmaster 2, the big sort of the previous big watch of the Rolex.
Well, the Deepsea is still a big watch. The regular sort of Deepsea is still 44. Like that is still a monstrous watch, but volume wise, this must be quite a lot bigger. It's also interesting. I want to know how big the dial is because it's hard to tell if it's the same size dial or if it's a small dial, or if it's a bigger dial. Like it's a really trippy. The rehort on it is just enormous. Like there's that rehort it's a lot of real estate. A lot
and all that. You don't get a sense of the depth, like how deep in the case is it as well.
No, so it'll be really interesting.
I'm sure we'll see it one day.
But what else, Felix? What else has been happening?
You sent me some, we talked a bit about chiming watches last week,
Yeah.
and Amiga got the all the buzz, but it might not have been the coolest chiming watch released in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, so I think Chris Hall alluded to this release when we were chatting to him in that episode, and he sort of said, sub 5K chime watch, and that was Christopher Ward. A bit of I don't want to say stealthy, but I feel like they're a little bit underrated. They did 300 of these watches chiming. It was 4,995 Australian dollars, so under 5K Aussie. It's
Solid.
$1.5 million, and they're all pre-sold, gone.
Nice. And it looks quite good.
Looks really good. Doesn't look like a Christopher Ward either, which is sort of interesting as well. It's sort of more.
Well, I mean, who can tell I think that's the thing about not underrated. Christopher Ward changes their brand identity every 3 minutes.
Also true, but honestly, slap an MBNF logo on there, and you've probably had 2 zeros.
Yeah, exactly. I
Controversial.
was reading the Worn and Wound article you sent through,
Yes.
and it's based on one of the first watches I professionally reviewed, because I for back in the early days on the Dink, I talked about that Chris Ward jump hour.
Yes.
So that's what the sort of the base movement is, and they've done some technical wizardry with it to make it a chiming watch. It looks a lot better now, I've got to say that.
It is interesting. Christopher Ward they've just been chipping away for the last 10 years. I feel like they're sort of building a really strong brand. And yeah, I mean, you say they reinvent themselves, which is also a fair call, but it feels like they're building something. Something's happening over there.
I mean, UK's they're doing interesting things in the UK. Quick question here. Spot quiz for you. Christopher Ward, C1 Bel Canto. You have one of the 300.
Yep.
What Artem strap are you putting on?
Oh, well, it's an interesting dial, so I think it needs an interesting strap. I might even do a NATO just to really kind of juxtapose
Juxtapose.
something, make a bit of a statement.
Okay, I think I'd do. I think I'd keep it clean with a loopless sailcloth, probably the blue.
You love the loopless. You're really into you hate loops, don't you?
I do. I mean, do you know what my favorite part or my least favorite part of the Melbourne public transport system is?
The city loop.
Exactly.
I think it would look good on one of the Admiralty kind of blue, the navy straps they've released, which is, I think, across most of their line now. Felix, the beauty of Artem straps is you can like loops, you can hate loops. You don't even have to like sailcloth. They've got NATOs as well, but they do really have something for everyone and every wrist.
Artem.straps, Instagram, artemstraps.com. For the 300 Christopher Ward owners out there, get on it.
Yeah. Hey, I got to ask you something.
Mm.
This is not in our list of notes, but I think we should talk about it.
You're not stealing my puns, are you?
No, I'm not stealing your puns. This is some big news in the international watch scene. We were talking about earlier. Archie Luxury, your mate, robbed.
Yeah, literally. I don't know. I didn't. I thought about putting this in, but I didn't really want to talk about it. But now I am. So
yeah, you are. Oh, look, it's unfortunate. It's sad news. It's sort of it appears that he's had 98% of his watch collection stolen when he was out of town.
A pretty significant collection, I think. Yeah. Yeah. So I think what's happened, Andy, is Archie Luxury he's sort of got a quasi public. It's not hard to work out who he is. He's pretty infamous, and he's gone on a trip to America, and some criminal people have taken that opportunity to break into his recording studio, break into his safe, and steal his watches.
Yeah, and I think they seem to have done a good job at it. They trashed the whole office, which is sad. Whether or not you're a fan of his work, it is not nice to see, and I think it's a reminder that everyone should be pretty careful. Don't post your address. Insure your watches. Get a big safe. Get a safety box.
Yeah, and even don't post your safe. Don't talk about your safe. Don't talk about your security. Don't
talk about it. I mean, if you're out of town, get a safety deposit box. It is so cheap. I think mine costs like $2 a day for a big one. And it's got like 4 or 5 layers of security, and literally cannot get in there without 2 keys and ID and fingerprints and all that sort of stuff. So just look it up. It's just worth it. It's not worth keeping stuff at home. You see it all over the news everywhere. It's just not worth it. Keep your stuff, safety deposit boxes. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure Archie Luxury is linked up everything that's missing, and keep an eye out for the serial numbers and all that as well. But yeah, unfortunate news.
Yes, I was on Twitter because now it's owned by the coolest guy in the world. I've decided to get back on Twitter.
The coolest guy in the world.
Yeah, Elon Musk. He's now the king of Twitter.
Oh God.
And I saw Mike Pearson, our friend and Zodiac exponent extraordinaire, tweeted Kenny Rogers had a Zodiac watch in the 90s.
Yeah.
Quick bit of digging revealed that it was auctioned off as part of his estate sale. Mr. Rogers passed away in 2020. And I've got to say, this is a ridiculously cool thing. Like, A, it's owned by Kenny Rogers, who's very, very cool. B, as far as a watch goes, it's an integrated Zodiac with a two-tone bracelet and a sort of a bezel. It kind of looks somewhere between a Vasher and Constantine overseas and I don't know, an Omega of those sort of 80s dive watches that Omega made. It's an auto. It's two tone. It's sort of super 90s. Sold for like 2,300 US. I just think it's cool.
I don't think that auction got a whole lot of interest. I think we missed it.
Yeah, I mean, it's why. I mean, it's we talk to people like Eric Wind, and we talk to people that sort of do the professional dealings.
Mm-hmm.
It's just outside the scope. Like, this is not Christie's. This is not Sotheby's. This is not significant important watches of 2022. It's Julian's Hollywood memorabilia. And there was also a Tag Heuer that was sold off, and some other random watches. I'm sure the family kept the more significant things, but I reckon that's what today. Like, if I was wanting to get into a significant historical watch, I would 100% buy Kenny Rogers, two-tone 90 Zodiac. That for me is far cooler than
something modern.
Yeah, even like I would rather if you said, Felix, can you have $50,000 and a beaten up Nautilus, or $48,000 in cash and Kenny Rogers Zodiac? I know what I'm picking.
I mean, I'm just shattered. I missed out on his 2010 Lexus RX 350. What a great car! Sold for $22,000. So, and it was driven by him.
Sometimes you've got to gamble.
Take a gamble on. Goodness me.
Goodness me. Oh, dearie me. Enough of Kenny Rogers. We need to talk this week about G-Shock. They're this week's episode sponsors, G-Shock Australia. Thank you very much. Check them out at gshock.com.au.
Yes, love G-Shock Australia. G-Shock is turning 40, and today we're celebrating by looking back at the iconic watch over the decades. This week we're going to start with the origins of the model, and that's the 1980s.
Yeah, I mean, 40 years of G-Shock, it's kind of crazy. Like, it feels very modern, but I guess it's getting on in years. So the story of G-Shock begins, like all good stories, with a broken watch. In 1981, a designer at Casio, a man named Mr. Kikuei Ibe, broke his watch. This led him to, as all good sort of designers and engineers, to come up with a concept of an unbreakable watch. So in 1981, he formed the incredibly named Team Tough, a small but elite group who aimed to solve the problem. And I'm sure Team Tough did not consist of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone, but I like to think that it spiritually did.
Like Minds. What an origin story.
So the core challenge that Ibe-san tried to solve was what they called the 10-10 concept. They wanted a watch that could handle a 10-meter drop, so that's sort of shock resistance, 10 bar or 100 meters of water resistance, and 10 years of battery life.
Wow.
In 1983, this was not an easy thing to do. And so they made prototype after prototype, and we're talking hundreds of prototypes. I'm sure it's in a museum somewhere, and there's probably some wild concepts out there. The story goes that Ibe-san randomly visited a playground and saw someone bouncing a rubber ball, and that led to a breakthrough about the shock resistance. The center of the ball would have been impacted differently to the outside of the ball, which led to the cushioning of the watch mechanism within a solid case. And it's this sort of G shock resistance, if you know what I'm saying, that puts the G in the name. So that was sort of the key breakthrough, and the battery life and the waterproofing came along with that. They overcame their challenges by 1983 and unveiled the very first G-Shock, DW5 1000C. It laid the groundwork, importantly, for the sort of the key design of the G-Shock. We're talking that big segmented rubber strap, that really clear geometric bezel, and the protected button design. Not to mention that, G-Shock protection text, which is such a sort of key part of the appeal of the watch for me. So that was the start in 83. It was followed by another couple of significant models in the 80s, obviously. In 1985, we saw DW5500C, aka G-Shock 2. We'll have a look for one. It's got a much more sort of 80s computer like, calculator watch aesthetic to it. But importantly, it has mud resistant case design. And that's something that, becomes more and more important with G-Shock over the years. And towards the end of the 80s, we got another really significant development, AW500, which has a rounder case design and is the first ever sort of Ana Digi G-Shock.
Yeah, pretty special stuff, Felix. Casio's done an amazing job with the technology, and now it just had to really win over the wearers. And that's where an ad from 1984 with a G-Shock being beaten by a hockey stick comes in. Love that sort of vintage ad patina. Yes. But what this ad did was bring in a awareness of the watch, and apparently initially popular with the people who needed a tough professional watch. People like firefighters, outdoorsy types, and so on.
And I mean that makes sense. Like it's this is a long time before smartphones, obviously, and watches were still an essential thing. And if you had a job where it was still pretty easy to break your watch. So if you had a job that was really easy to break your watch, this is somewhere where the G-Shock would have a clear sort of unique sales pitch or a unique sort of point of differentiation. And I think once, apparently, I don't have the figures or anything, but apparently it was a bit of a slow start with the G-Shock as well. But when you win over those key communities of like, the firefighter or police or, people that, I don't know, hike,
everyone follows.
Sort of word of mouth, I think really works a lot. But also, we'll link up that hockey ad in the show notes. It's
amazing. I mean, I've been building a lot of furniture, a lot of IKEA runs, a lot of warehouse visits, and I've been wearing a G-Shock nonstop for probably the last 8 days.
And I think there's a reason, like when even today, like, watch collectors, or watch people, they're always like, oh, I'm doing yard work, I'm going holidays. It's always a G-Shock that they wear. And that's because that's what it was built for.
Exactly. And you want to wear a watch and you want something that's tough. And I tell you what, the digital display, time, date, month, all that stuff, just like glancing down and not even having to think about reading an analog. It's nice sometimes.
Yeah.
It's nice.
That's where the G-Shock started, with a broken watch, a pretty sort of cool engineering challenge back in the day. And it was sort of born out of a function over form aesthetic. But that sort of changes in next week's installment, Andy. We talk about the 90s, where the G-Shock becomes a genuine pop culture phenomenon.
I love it. I can't wait for the next history lesson.
We'll have to talk about that next week, though, Andy. So head to gshock.com.au to see how the watch is looking 40 years on.
Can't wait. All right, Felix, I think the time is now.
It's always the time is now.
The time is now.
Get, Kristen on.
Let's do it.
Andy, today we speak to Kristen Shirley, who is a journalist and editor who spends most of her time talking about the finer things in life, from fine watches to, I don't know, fine wines. She's the founder of La Patiala and has just published the Watch Encyclopaedia, which is a compilation of articles aimed at demystifying the world of watches. Welcome to OT. Kristen, how are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
No, it's our pleasure, and we should kick off with a bit about your background. I mean, looking at your website, the Waterford Crystal banner ads tell me, I think, enough about what to expect, which is, a luxury bend. But what can we expect from your website? What's it about? What are you about?
Sure. So my background is I'm a journalist. I specialize in luxury, but I actually started in the fashion industry. I was a fashion editor at Elle magazine for a long time. And then I moved to a luxury publication where I had to start covering all sorts of different luxury categories: travel, food, wine, watches, jewelry. And there was a really steep learning curve because I couldn't find the entry level information that was written by a quality, trusted source. Most of the really amazing websites out there focus on news and they assume a baseline of knowledge, or they're geared towards experts. So I founded the Patiala to really be the ultimate luxury resource for anyone who's curious about luxury. It gives you 101 information on tons of different areas of the luxury world. And then it also has deep dives that would be appealing to connoisseurs and collectors. So if you learn about, so if you already know about watches, but you want to learn about wine or tequila, or you're looking for a luxury travel guide, you can go to the website and find those different resources here too.
Yeah, and so it's a mixture of sort of text, but also you do videos. I mean, I hopped on your Instagram and I saw some reels. Is that sort of the direction you want to take the website? A bit more sort of video content?
Yeah, I think video is really important for readers today. And, some people only want to watch videos and then some people only want to read. So I think it's important to have both. And then when you're talking about something like how to shuck oysters, which is one of the videos that I have on the site,
Mm.
obviously video is superior to, the written word.
Yes.
And, I have one about savoring champagne, and people don't quite get how savoring champagne works until you show them. So I think video is really important for things like that.
Yeah, I mean, if you go anywhere near, savoring champagne, you have to capture it on video. I think that's one of the essential
Legally,
rules.
I think it's like by law you have to, yeah.
I,
If you
I would
savor
agree
a
with
bottle
that.
in the forest, no one sells it. Did you even savor it? We were talking, Andy and I were talking just before you came on about, sort of having a look at your site and thinking back to when we first became involved in watches in sort of a professional sense. I think Andy was saying he sort of went to a Tudor launch early on. What was your first, back when you were at L or whatever, what was your first job where they said, Kristen, we need you to, fly to Switzerland or cover this event or cover this launch? Do you remember what that was?
Yes, it was going to Baselworld, actually. I went to
Wow.
Baselworld less than a month after I started my job. And I remember I had a friend who worked retail at Blancpain. So I said, hey, can I come by the boutique and you can give me a little crash course in watches? And we walked in and he was showing me some watches and he said, and this watch is automatic. And I said, what's automatic? And he said, oh, okay, you're in trouble. So he gave me a little primer on watches. And then I went to Baselworld and I was just really upfront. This is my first time here. I've never covered watches before. And I had the opportunity to ask all of the questions that, I'm sure a lot of people have, but never get to ask.
Sure.
So it was, 5 or 6 days of back-to-back meetings, 9 to 6, a different brand every 30 minutes. I saw hundreds, if not thousands of watches. And I was very quickly became obsessed with timepieces.
That's cool.
I was just fascinated by the movements, the complications. I didn't know what a tourbillon was, and seeing them twirl on the dial, it was just absolutely
Neither,
magical.
neither,
So,
to be honest.
I don't
yeah,
think anyone really knows what they do.
Tourbillons, yeah.
yeah.
So
Well,
that's an incredible way to sort of, and not an uncommon, like for a journalist to sort of suddenly be given a job outside their, comfort zone.
mhm.
That's pretty, reasonable, I suppose. But that's such a cool experience to like have that learning opportunity from the center of the watch world, so to speak. What were you most? What sort of questions were you asking, or what sort of meetings do you remember like coming out of going, wow, I have so much of more of an appreciation for, whatever brand or aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I remember asking questions like, "Why does this watch say there has 21 jewels?" I mean, there are no diamonds on it
Sure.
because I didn't know what jewels were. And, coming as a newcomer, if you look at watches, you're like, "Why do all these watches say how many jewels there are?" You think it has to be an important thing, and then you realize, it's not that important. But I remember going to Louis Moinet and just seeing their timepieces, which are so complex and intricate, and there were like meteorites on the dial. And I remember being blown away by just how complex they were, and it started a passion for independent watchmakers.
It's really interesting, and it's really interesting that Baselworld was sort of your first, the foray into watches, and it's a bit of a baptism of fire, as they say, because as you said before, I mean, you'd be lucky to get a 30-minute appointment. You're probably doing 3 or 4 an hour for a week straight. Do you
Yeah.
kind of look back at that and appreciate just the intensity of the experience, and I guess at the same time probably miss the fair itself?
Well, I think, trial by fire or baptism by fire, whatever the saying is, absolutely. I think I got to learn so much so quickly, and that really cemented my knowledge because I was seeing the same things over and over, and I was able to learn versus seeing, a couple watches once a week for a few months. It would take a lot longer to really retain all of that information. And, I don't really miss Baselworld. Wasn't a huge fan of the city and the prices and the food and I just stayed in terrible, terrible hotels. So I much prefer the Geneva show, to tell you the truth. It's a little
Yeah.
more elegant.
Yeah, it might lack some of the atmosphere, but I don't know.
It's not
Atmosphere
really
is
luxury either, Felix. That was the thing we always talked about was, for a fair that focused on luxury watches, there's just no luxury element to going to it at
That's
all.
strange. It's it could be selling washing machines.
Yeah, I know. You'd be like eating a sausage standing up with people blowing cigarette smoke in your face, and you're like, how is this a luxury world? And,
It's
it's really
very
not.
European though.
Yeah. I do miss the Three Kings, though. That was fun.
Sure. I mean, I do not miss the prices at the Three Kings. I never, I wasn't on a corporate credit card. I couldn't afford to drink there.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was with the brand, so I would let them pay.
Of course, yes. That's only polite. Um,
Yeah.
what do you think? So you've mentioned a few things. You're talking about tourbillons, movement jewels. For someone that's new to the space of sort of luxury watches, what do you come across as the most common mystifying elements or questions that people have that people in the space might take as assumed knowledge?
Well, I think one of the most basic and frequent ones that I hear of is people will come in to buy a mechanical watch. They'll know which watch they want, and they'll come back a few days later and say, my watch is broken. It's not telling me the time anymore because they don't know it's a mechanical watch that needs to be wound. So just at that level, people spending $15,000, $20,000 on a watch think it has a battery in it. So explaining movements, winding watches, automatic, quartz, manual, explaining all the difference there. And then I think people don't really understand, how a lot of the complications work. And so I have a whole section dedicated to complications where people can learn, even if you can't ever afford a chiming watch, it's interesting to know how they work. And I think it helps you appreciate the artistry, the craftsmanship, and just the technical capabilities that these watchmakers have to create these watches that sound the hours, minutes, and quarter hours.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting, you're talking about that experience of someone spending significant money on something and coming back and it not working, or they're having a negative experience with it, which I think is quite remarkable in luxury. Do you think that brands are doing enough to, either in the sales room context to sort of evaluate, what the customer's knowledge level is and providing that support? Because I can imagine it would be, intimidating or frustrating depending on what sort of a person you are to have that experience. What's
Absolutely.
what's the way around it?
I think there's a fine line because if someone comes in and says, I want this model, you assume that they know what they're buying. So you don't want to insult their intelligence by saying, and you have to wind this watch. And then, brands have also talked down to certain groups of people. I've had people say really silly things to me about my watch knowledge, even though I'm a journalist at a fair. So you don't want to insult women either. So I think people are sort of holding back and letting the customer lead the conversation to avoid insulting anyone or hurting their feelings. And to your point, that can lead to them not getting the information they need because people are embarrassed to ask questions a lot of the time, especially when you're in the luxury world. These are intelligent, powerful people who are pretty wealthy and they, think they know everything. So they don't want to ask the silly questions. And that's one reason why I started the website, because I've asked all the silly questions that exist and I've written the stories to provide the answers so that you don't have to do that yourself.
Yeah, I love that. And I think one thing we should touch on, at first glance, looking at your website, I kind of to me anyway, it kind of felt like it maybe was more focused towards women, but then it kind of as I got deeper on it, it didn't seem that skewed towards women. So maybe you can kind of correct me there, but I'm curious to hear your take on sort of women's representation in kind of the watch industry, especially on the media front, because that is something we've seen a lot of growth in. I mean, I think over the last couple of years, but I'm curious to hear your take.
Sure. So the website is unisex. All of my stories feature men's and women's watches, except for some stories that only feature women's watches, because
Mm.
I think there's so many resources out there dedicated to men, and women's timepieces don't get the coverage that they deserve a lot of the times. So there are watch stories just for women, but in general, the site is very geared towards whoever is interested in
Yep.
luxury. And there will be some sections that are more male focused and some women focused. It just really depends on the topic and people's interests. And then in terms of media, yeah, when I first started covering watches, there were not a lot of women in the industry. There were established veterans and then, a few younger people. And I've definitely seen the industry really open up. There are some great girls out there who are approaching watches from a completely different direction and opening up the industry to more people. And I think it's a really fun time to be around and see what's happening. And um, hopefully it will just continue to evolve and make watchmaking more open to everybody.
Yeah, I think that's even down here where we're a much smaller sort of part of the watch world. I think that's something that's we can see happening as well.
Great.
That sort of talk about changing sort of evolutions in the watch space and changing trends, if you want to call it that. What's America's sort of taste for watches like at the moment? Like when we're talking to brands, we hear a lot about America's, the second biggest market. They've got an interest in large watches. They've got an interest in this, or this model's really popular in America. It's obviously a hugely important market, but as someone that's there and covering it fairly intimately, what's happening there at the moment?
Well, the watch market is on fire. People are more interested in watches than ever. Supply is still limited or demand is too high. You walk into a lot of watch stores and they look like they've been robbed. They're just completely empty. There's not a watch for people to try on, to look at. So I think brands are really doing well and also trying to find different ways to connect with customers. I think there are a lot of new resources out there that are bringing more people into the watch world. And some of it is, the hive mentality. Oh, this Nautilus, so and
Mm.
so has a Nautilus. Now I want one, or they have this Rolex. I want this Rolex. And then once they get into the industry, they start to learn about other watches, collect other things. But I do think people are really following the trends and it's like keeping up with the Joneses, is what we say over here.
Yeah, sure. We keep up with the Joneses over here as well.
Oh,
Um,
good.
what brands are doing particularly well? Like, I mean, there's a lot of you sort of said certain brands and certain resources, but who do you think is performing exceptionally, or just sort of on fire at the moment from your point of view?
Yeah, at retail, I would say Audemars Piguet, Rolex, Patek Philippe, and Richard Mille. These are the four
Sure.
brands that are just selling out everywhere. Um, Long waiting lists, can't get your hands on anything. And then it's continuing on to other brands that have similar styles. Vacheron Constantin is another one that's now super hot. Gerard Perico, Laureato. There are wait lists on that watch some places, which wouldn't have happened a
Really?
few years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it
Yeah.
could have got
What a
30%
retailer
off
was
a few
telling
years
me
ago.
that. I know, yeah. But now, because it's, got a similar K shape to some iconic timepieces, it's a historic brand, in house movement, great craftsmanship, beautiful dial. People are saying, okay, I can buy this watch at retail now, or I can buy a bunch of other watches and try to have the privilege of buying this watch in a year or two, or pay 3x, for a pre owned one. So I think people are starting to open up to more brands, which is really, it makes me really happy.
On that, something, as someone dedicated to sort of educating, people about watches and the watch industry, that being you, one thing I find quite hard and tiring is, you meet people all the time. Oh yeah, Andy's into watches, whatever, and then they start asking you about these models and these, you know, oh, I want this watch, and it's the Cosmograph, and they pull the phone out, and what's coming, and then you have to spend 5 or 10 minutes explaining to them why they can't, and why you can't even go and get a Daytona at retail, and then explaining why the secondary market is how it is. But I'm curious, as someone with the educator hat on, how do you explain that to kind of newcomers in a really kind of efficient way?
I just sort of say, if you want this watch, you have to be one of the retailer's best clients, because why would they give it to someone they don't know who hasn't spent money at supporting their business over the years? If you want this, go into the store, tell them what you want, go buy some other watches. If they sell jewelry, buy some jewelry, show them that you're not flipping it, and then you'll be able to ultimately get this watch once you've developed a relationship with them. But, I just sort of explained to them supply, demand, the hive mentality. And um, yeah, people get it kind of soon. You just talk about it as limited edition, or, even compare it to like the Supreme sneaker drops.
Mm.
and they get that a little bit more.
You just get the chart out, the old supply
Yeah.
demand chart out,
Yeah.
and show them. Well, that's really interesting. One thing we've not talked about, obviously, is your personal taste in watches. I did see something wrapped around your wrist in an Instagram post. But why don't you tell us kind of what you like in watches, maybe what
Sure.
you're wearing?
Sure, yeah. So right now I'm wearing a Chaché-Lecoultre Reverso Duetto. It's one of my favorite watches. I favor slim timepieces. I like watches that are under 30 millimeters. Love mechanical movements. I have this Reverso. I have a vintage Piaget watch. It's a beautiful gold watch with a gray mother of pearl dial, diamonds, and a teeny little mechanical movement inside. I love it so much. It has the shortest power reserve, but I'll take it. And then I also love jewelry watches. I have a Bulgari Serpenti triple wrap bracelet that I'm obsessed with. I just think it's so glamorous and fun and unique. And, it's a great conversation piece. And wearing a watch like that also helps women who like jewelry, they like beautiful things, understand that, oh, a watch isn't like a boring thing that my dad wears. It's something that I can wear to express my personality and my personal style. Um, so I love that watch. And then I have a Baume & Mercier watch that I inherited from my grandmother when she passed away, that she bought in Paris. And so that one's really special to me.
Lovely. Well, you were just sort of reminding me there, talking about jewelry watches. That's something that, so, my journey is, in a similar way, going to Basel and finding out about watches very quickly. One thing that I always find myself fascinated with, and that, as I'm a guy, catering to a very sort of male focused space, they tend to gloss over like the highly jeweled pieces. But I find them incredibly interesting because it's such a specific skill, like, gem setting and, gem grading, and that side of, the habillage on watches is something that isn't talked about very much, by a lot of, traditional technical watch media. What do you think are some sort of great resources or places for people that want to learn more about what a good stone set watch is beyond, carats and, the number of rocks on the dial?
No, I agree. People generally do gloss over them, which is a shame because these watches are works of art that are definitely more difficult to create than a steel sports watch. I do have a bunch of jewelry watch stories on my website, but if you are interested in the craftsmanship, a lot of the brands, funny enough, have really detailed sections on how they do their craftsmanship and put it together. Specifically, I know Patek Philippe talks a lot about their gem setting on their website, and that, they have a proprietary setting technique that was developed specifically for watch cases to let more light in so that the diamonds have more sparkle, because when you set a diamond into a case, obviously it can't catch light from the bottom as it can in
Mm.
most jewelry mountings. So it's really interesting to see what brands are doing. And I know a lot of people, even men, one of their favorite watches from Watches and Wonders this year was the Cartier Cousin watch that had the squishy gem set case. Did you see that
Mm,
one?
Mm.
It was
incredible.
wild.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Two of the ones that, on that sort of track that really have stood out to me recently, uh, Jaeger have, I think it's called the Griff setting on their rendezvous. So it's a different, and it's specifically for that to let, more light in around the stone, which is really beautiful in person. And another one I think that doesn't get enough credibility for this, how well they do stone set watches is Chopard. Like they, even their
Mm.
sort of men's pieces, there's, some
Yep.
with beautiful baguette bezels that are really, really understated and lovely. But that's just me. I'm not really asking questions there.
No, absolutely. Chopard and Piaget, two houses that make amazing in-house movements and also have fantastic gem setting because they are high jewelry houses. A lot of the other, pure watchmakers, not the big brands, but some smaller ones do have to work with external gem setters because they don't have the capability in-house.
Yeah, it's interesting. It is cool to see how some of the more jewelry focused brands come across into watches and how they've developed. And we've talked about them. We always come back to Cartier and just the brilliant collection and work that they really do across the board. But what I want to ask you is more specific towards what we've seen in the last year. It's November in a couple of days, like 3 days away from November, which is a little bit scary. We're sort of wrapping the year out. It's sort of the first year we've really had that's back to, I guess, normal in terms of travel and watch fairs and release schedules. But do you have any kind of hot takes on the year that was in terms of releases, things you've seen? I mean, there's been a bunch of stuff happening in the last 2 weeks in the watch industry. I've got Felix and I have a very hot take that we that we share privately over a recent trip to Sicily. But I'd love to hear what your take on the year of releases is.
Sure, yeah. I think there were two things happening. People were doing what they did best, playing the greatest hits and sort of trying to appeal to people who aren't interested in branching out. And then I think we saw a lot of really interesting technical innovations, and brands are just continuing to push the boundaries of what can be done, whether that's Bulgari and Richard Mille creating, these wildly
Mm.
thin watches that are the thickness of like a US quarter. I mean, they're so thin, it's kind of unbelievable. Cartier is always doing wild things. Like their Mass Mysterious watch was just wild, incorporating the movement into the rotor in a mystery setting. I still have no idea how they did that. And then, you see like the Patek releases recently. I loved all the chronograph watches. I thought it was amazing. Seeing a lot of left-handed stuff happening, which was interesting. And I'm sure all the lefties are happy. Um, yeah, so those are the two things that I'm seeing. What are your hot takes?
Well, we go spicy. I mean, I'll throw this out there because I think we're far enough away that we won't get physically hurt, Felix. But we talk about the Jacob and Co. And one thing we're sort of saying is, I probably said 3 weeks ago to Felix in our Discord we have for the podcast. Jacob and Co. appears to be making like a pop culture comeback, and it's sort of, I think the next 2 years they'll just absolutely be everywhere, and they're obviously investing a lot of money into product placement and getting on, reality TV show especially, and really that higher end focus. So any of those shows, based around LA or New York, real estate shows, whatever they are, it's just a Jacob on the wrist. And, one thing we had Chris Hall, who's Mr. Porter, on just yesterday, and he just published his newsletter, and sort of he touched on, the glaring omission about, the Jacob and Co brand, links of the Godfather movie and the fact that they actually hosted that event was Sicily, wasn't it, Felix?
Yeah, and I mean, sort of maybe a bit of a tone deaf, celebrating organised crime in Sicily,
where they sort of don't celebrate it at all, and they're sort of they really dislike the whole mafia thing.
It's an interesting space, and I think that's it's fascinating watching that brand sort of come back into focus. And I think another one, obviously, without the quite so much controversy, is we're seeing Frank Mueller really begin to sort of shine again in a way they haven't, in the last few years. So I think they're one on a sort of a aggressive path forward. And I want to see what they're doing in the future.
Oh, they actually haven't been on my radar. Frank Mueller, what are they doing?
Yeah, they're starting to do some sort of cool collaborations, and I think that's sort of a lead up into, that
slow and
marketing.
steady, isn't it, Felix? Like it's sort of, they did the Asham, Bamford and King Nerd collab. It must have been last year. I think it was a Casablanca piece, and it was really limited. Like I think it was like a dozen or maybe under a dozen pieces. And then they've just done that Bamford Popeye watch maybe a couple of weeks ago. And
right.
It seems like they're taking a more conservative approach in sort of doing some brand building before they really fire up the cylinders.
And I think the time's right. We've sort of got that 90s nostalgia happening. So,
Yeah.
we're going to start seeing Master Bankers and Curvexes, become cool again. In a way.
What's
You
more
go.
90s than that?
Well, are we going to see the 2000s, like, that late 90s, early 2000s, because it's that 20-year cycle of nostalgia.
Jacob and Co. as well. That's when they were first.
Yeah, Hublot, Jacob and Co, Frank. Those were the the brands even Chopard in that time period that were really dominating the space. And if you time it with maybe everyone's getting a bit of Rolex, AP, Patek fatigue, maybe it's sort of coming together for a time where we're going to see, I don't know, I guess heritage pieces that are 20 years old, which kind of makes sense.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, we're seeing a return to smaller watches too. That's definitely something that wasn't happening with 45 millimeter watches that we've been seeing in the past decade. But, I don't know if those brands are like the 90s styles are going to come back just because it is so expensive to buy watches. Are people going to want something that will maybe not be cool in a couple years? That I think it's different from buying like a pair of baggy jeans or,
Yeah, sure. That's true.
Yeah.
We have trends though, right? Like you see it in everything, and
Yeah.
there's always been dated watch designs. Like there's stuff that you go, oh, this didn't age well, and then you have the designs that age perfectly well, and that's why they don't change them and they stay the same, and everyone has always wanted the same models. So maybe, and I think consumers, and one thing about watches especially is that consumers have like a life cycle of buying what they think they like, figuring out what they like, and then only buying what they like. And it's sort of it's that journey. So maybe it just depends on when it's time for the masses and the mainstream looking at watches. But what we normally do with our guests is we ask for a recommendation on something they've been enjoying. Now, I figure you're a good person to ask several recommendations, and I figured it would be a good way to split it up would be to sort of look at your expertise, because you travel, beauty, watches, jewelry. So why don't we get a couple of recommendations from an expert on, maybe start with travel?
Sure. What are you looking for in terms of travel?
Your favorite place to go?
Well, I love a beach. I was just in the Maldives, which was actually the first time I'd ever been there, and I thought it was absolutely spectacular. If you just want to lay on a beach in luxury and not really do anything, highly recommend. But from Australia, I think the Cook Islands is a really great destination. Have you ever been there? Are you familiar with it?
I'm familiar with it. I've never been. Felix, have you been to Cook
Never
Islands?
been.
Okay.
No, I think like a lot of Australians, I tend not to go particularly close. Like if I'm getting on a plane, I'm going to go to Europe or America.
Okay.
You
Well,
know
the
what I mean?
Cook Islands are like, yeah, I get that. The Cook Islands are like Hawaii was 50 years ago. So there's not a
Yeah,
ton
sure.
of development. It feels really authentic. I love it there. And they have some really beautiful boutique luxury properties. So I think people are really just looking for experiences. They want to spend time with the people that they're traveling with, whether that's getting the great cultural experience or if you're just relaxing. Like I took a family vacation to Turks and Caicos earlier this year, and we just had the best time, everyone reconnecting. And I think that's going to be a big theme in travel for the next year at least.
Yeah, amazing. I'm Googling flights to Cook Islands at the moment, and it's surprisingly not that close. Felix. It's like a 15-hour
it's
flight.
middle of the Pacific, yeah? Right,
Yeah, it's like a 12-hour
Yeah.
flight. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's sort of close. Okay,
Yeah.
next. I don't know. Let's get a watch recommendation from you. Your favorite watch, or your next watch.
Next watch.
Your next watch.
No,
well,
no budget, by the way. It doesn't have to be realistic.
Website's going good.
Well,
Things are
if I could get a
well.
cardiac crash, I would die a happy lady.
we
But
all?
the next watch that I think I can actually get is, I love an H. Moser concept watch. I just think their Fume dials are so beautiful. I love that they don't have any indexes, no signature. I just think they're absolutely stunning. So that would be next on my list.
Edward, if you're listening. And finally, what about a style or beauty, I don't know, hot tip?
Hot tip for
We'll
a couple
keep
of
it
very
cheap. We'll keep
tired Australian men.
Yeah.
A hot tip
Moisturizer.
for Australian men. All right. Well, I will say, please wash your face every night
Thank you kindly.
and wear sunscreen every day.
Oh, okay, do that.
Sunscreen we're very good on. We're not allowed to
Yeah.
play in school as
Yeah.
children without sunscreen and hats.
Oh, really? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Well, then I would say you should wear a face mask once a week, and you'll
Once a
like the
week.
results that you see. Yeah.
Okay.
Done.
What's
That's
the
next OT
face
podcast,
mask
so.
brand?
Any face mask. You
Any
can,
face mask.
whatever your skin needs. Does it need more moisture? Are you oily? Just find something that suits. I mean, I have expensive taste. I use La Prairie and Valmont face masks.
Okay.
Love everything
Jeez.
Swiss. So yeah, I wear face masks 3 times a week.
The OT
Incredible.
spa, Felix.
Yes, we're doing it wrong, Andy.
We need to do a spa day.
Kristen, it's been absolutely lovely to chat to you and to find out more about yourself and La Patiala. Thank you so much for taking the time, and we will link everything up in the show notes.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you guys, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your show.
No, thank you. What a lovely person to talk to, Felix.
Yeah. So thank you, Kristen, for having a chat to us. We've
Delightful.
linked up La Patiala. Do you know who else we need to thank, Andy?
Obviously, we need to thank G-Shock Australia for supporting OT, the podcast this week. We hope you enjoyed Felix's history lesson. We should also thank Artem Straps, Artem.straps. Check him out.
Oh, we'll have to talk about this next week too.
What's that?
I forgot to talk about it. The Mario G-Shock.
Oh, yes. Legitimately cool. Let's talk about it next week.
Yes. OT the podcast on Instagram, OT the podcast at gmail.com.
Join our Discord.
Subscribe, Discord, all the usual.
5-star reviews.
Yeah.
All of it. All right. We'll see you next week, guys.
Cheers.